you sent me some pretty detailed notes, as you always do, about what went down in Glasgow and some of the goals, their objectives, the tools by which they plan to control our comings, our goings, all the basically just like COVID, but with climate change as the reason instead of the Wu flu. And one of them was secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Explain this to us. I know we had Justin Trudeau out talking about this, and we'll get to that, but what does this mean at the UN level?
Well, it is called sometimes sarcastically the King Canute Clause. The idea that we can control the climate. And, since 1880 or thereabouts, when the Little Ice Age ended, we've seen an increase in temperature of 1.1, 1.2 degrees averaged over the whole Earth. And what the UN are saying is that if it goes beyond 1.5 degrees, only 0.3 more, that we're going to see catastrophe. And so
how do they know this? Sorry to stop you, Tom, but how do they know this? Because they say this with such surety.
I know.
But how do they even know? Because when I look outside and it's 0 degrees today, and I'm thinking, so a longer growing season and less harsh climate here in Alberta where we make all your food. And I'm supposed to be mad about this? I don't know.
Well, that's right. Yeah, a lot of it's pretty silly because if the greenhouse gas models are right, and that's a big question.
Sure.
If they are right, most of the warming would occur at night in the winter in high latitudes. And I don't think there's very many polar bears or any kind of wildlife or plants or anything that would care if it was minus 38 instead of minus 40.
Right.
So, so I mean, the whole idea that another 0.3 degrees is somehow critical is silly. But, it's also even more fundamental than that, Sheila. I mean, the whole idea of us being worried about a global average temperature is also equally silly because nobody lives in the globe. There's no super being that straddles the planet and says, oh, right. I feel more hot or I feel colder. And a good example of why the global temperature is really immaterial is the following. Let's say half of the Earth got 0.5, let's say half the Earth got 10 degrees warmer, and let's say half the Earth got 10 degrees colder. Well, the difference in temperature would be so great, you'd have massive pressure gradients, you'd have extreme weather, it would be an absolute disaster. And yet with half getting warmer by the same amount that half of it's getting colder, the average temperature wouldn't change. It would just be the same. So average temperature is a really pretty meaningless statistic. It doesn't really mean anything. Here in Ottawa, for example, they say that the average temperature is rising in the summer. Well, actually, the maximum temperature is not rising. It's getting slightly less cool at night. So the average is rising. But so what? This whole concept that we have to stop an average temperature from changing is silly. And even more fundamentally, the whole idea that carbon dioxide drives climate is silly. There's a new paper that's come out. William Happer and a professor at York University. William Happer is one of our buddies. He's from Princeton. He was an advisor to Trump, actually, on this issue. They've published a paper recently where they analyzed how much potential increase in warming could there be due to increasing greenhouse gases. And they looked at the different greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and other ones. And they found that with respect to carbon dioxide, we've achieved virtually all of the warming that carbon dioxide can cause. So even if there were a doubling of carbon dioxide, we're seeing, according to his models, and these are being, this is a very reputable scientist doing these studies, and it's being validated by many people, they're showing that CO2 doubling will have virtually no effect. Okay, because they look at the absorption lines in the spectrum and they look at how much energy is being absorbed now by carbon dioxide and how much would be absorbed if there was twice as much carbon dioxide. And the change is so small, you have to really look closely at the graph to even see it. Now, the other thing that they found, which I found pretty intriguing, considering that Trudeau signed on to this methane pledge, is that the impact of methane is apparently only about 1/10 the impact of carbon dioxide. So if carbon dioxide doubling causes almost no temperature rise, then methane is not a problem at all. And yet Trudeau has committed huge commitments to reduce methane from the oil and gas sector. And, we can get into that because his different commitments are very damaging for Canada.
Yeah, we'll get to those in a second. I noticed that some of the tools by which they plan to achieve net zero are in contrast with each other. So one of them is to accelerate the phase out of coal. Okay. And curtail deforestation. Well, if you accelerate the phase out of coal, that's going to lead to deforestation in the developing world because they'll go back to using their forests to heat their homes, to cook their food, for even electricity. You also see the same people arguing for using biofuels and burning pellets for electricity. And it's like, where do you think that comes from? By the way, if you want more trees, you need carbon dioxide. It's tree food.
That's right. And the only measurable impact of carbon dioxide on the biosphere so far, the increase that we've seen, and we've seen about a 50% increase since the Industrial Revolution. The only measurable impact has been a densification of forests and a huge increase in crop yield. So, I mean, CO2 is a good thing, and people that study agriculture are hoping CO2 continues to rise so that we can feed billions of people. But this business of coal phase out is a real problem because just during the COP conference, and you won't believe this, while Trudeau was saying how we're going to phase out coal completely, I think he said by 2030, we can get into that. Australia announced 116 new fossil fuel plants. And there are a lot of those, of course, in Australia, they're always coal. And apparently this is going to cause a 30% increase in Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And they announced that right during the COP conference.
Good for them.
And India, of course, has told all of their producers of coal, boost and ramp up your coal production, because, of course, their new commitment is to be net zero by 2070. 2070. Now, there's actually a funny joke that's going around the UN climate conference. I was told this by people at the conference. They're saying that some of these commitments, like India's net zero by 2070, it's like a 75-year-old alcoholic saying, I'm going to quit drinking in the next 30 years.
Yeah. I'll start my diet tomorrow, Tom. It's fine.
That's right. I'll start my diet in a half a century, which is what India is essentially saying. They're going to be net zero by 2070. Oh, but in the meantime, we're going to massively expand our coal usage, which of course makes sense because their first and overriding priority is poverty alleviation and keeping their people fed. So, I mean, coal is a magnificent product. And if you burn it cleanly, it's absolutely fine. There's no reason for them to be cutting back on coal in Canada. Mm-hmm. I mean, Canada has about the cleanest coal stations you can imagine.
You'd like to get access to my show as well as other great TV style shows too, like Ezra's Nightly, Ezra Levant Show, and David Menzies' Friday night show, Rebel Roundup. Just go to rebelnews.com/subscribe. That's rebelnews.com/subscribe.